There's a pattern you've probably noticed but haven't fully examined. Everywhere you look, you're told to be positive. Think positive. Stay positive. Good vibes only. Negative thoughts attract negative outcomes. If you just believe hard enough, manifest correctly enough, maintain the right mindset, everything will work out. And anyone who points out actual problems, real constraints, or uncomfortable truths, they're labeled toxic, negative, energy vampires who need to be removed from your life. This isn't just cultural preference or personal philosophy. It's a systematic way of preventing people from seeing clearly. When you're required to interpret everything through a filter of mandatory optimism, you lose the ability to accurately assess reality. And when you can't assess reality, you become extraordinarily vulnerable to manipulation by anyone who understands what you refuse to see. Right now, you're probably surrounded by this pressure. Social media demands you share only wins, never losses. Self-help gurus insist that acknowledging problems gives them power. Friends tell you to stay positive when you try to discuss actual concerns. Workplaces enforce cultures of toxic positivity, where raising issues is career suicide. The message is clear and constant. Optimism is mandatory, and anything else is personal failing. Most people internalize this without examining it. They genuinely believe that refusing to acknowledge problems will make problems disappear, that maintaining positive thoughts will override negative reality, that pessimism causes bad outcomes while optimism prevents them. These beliefs make them feel better in the short term, but they also make them blind to patterns, deaf to warnings, and vulnerable to anyone exploiting their systematic refusal to see clearly. Machiavelli lived in Renaissance Italy, where political survival required accurate assessment of threat. Leaders who saw reality clearly and adapted to it survived. Leaders who maintained optimistic delusions about human nature, political dynamics, or military capability were destroyed. And he understood that clear sight, even when what you see is uncomfortable, is more valuable than comforting illusions that leave you unprepared for reality. This video will explore 8 principles explaining how mandatory optimism and forced positive thinking keep you blind to reality and vulnerable to constant manipulation. Not to make you cynical or negative, but to show you why clear observation, including of uncomfortable truths, is more valuable than feel-good illusions that leave you defenseless. Now, I want you to drop this affirmation in the comments. I see clearly. Machiavelli's observation on necessary realism. Machiavelli's core insight was that leaders who saw the world as it actually is survived, while leaders who saw the world as they wished it to be perished. He didn't advocate cruelty. He observed that ignoring human capacity for cruelty left you unprepared when it inevitably emerged. His advice wasn't pessimistic. It was realistic. And that realism, that willingness to see uncomfortable truths, was what separated effective leaders from destroyed ones. Mandatory optimism would have been politically fatal. 1. Forced optimism. Functions as social control. Here's the first pattern. Mandatory positivity isn't about your well-being. It's about making you manageable. When you're required to interpret everything positively, when acknowledging problems is taboo, when raising concerns gets you labeled as negative, you become much easier to control, because you've lost the ability to accurately identify and articulate when you're being exploited, manipulated, or harmed. Watch how this operates in workplaces. Companies create positive culture where employees can't voice concerns about workload, compensation, or management without being labelled cultural detractors. This isn't because positivity improves performance. It's because it prevents organised resistance to poor conditions. If you can't acknowledge that conditions are bad without being ostracised, you can't organise to change them. Think about how this plays out in relationships. Partners who insist you stay positive about relationship problems aren't helping you. They're preventing you from addressing issues that need fixing. By making problem identification itself problematic, they ensure problems never get solved. You're too busy forcing optimism to notice you're being neglected, exploited, or systematically devalued. Look at how this functions politically. Leaders who face legitimate criticism dismiss critics as negative or pessimistic. This frames the criticism itself as the problem rather than the conditions being criticized. Citizens who internalize mandatory optimism become unable to accurately assess whether their government is functioning or failing, because acknowledging failure feels like personal negativity. The philosophical insight is that forcing people to maintain positive interpretations of negative circumstances is a control mechanism. It doesn't make circumstances better. It makes people less able to recognize and resist when circumstances are actively harmful. Optimism becomes a tool of pacification rather than genuine well-being. When you understand this pattern, you can see why so many systems enforce mandatory positivity. Not because it serves you, but because it serves those who benefit from your inability to clearly identify when you're being exploited. Forced optimism creates compliant subjects who interpret their own exploitation positively. I want you to drop this affirmation in the comments. I understand the game. 2. Positive thinking suppresses critical analysis. Pay attention to this dynamic. When you're required to think positively, you lose the ability to think critically. Critical thinking requires examining evidence objectively, including negative evidence. But positive thinking culture demands you interpret all evidence through a filter that confirms optimistic conclusions. This systematically destroys your capacity for accurate analysis. Watch what happens when you try to think critically in positive thinking environments. You examine evidence. Some of it is positive, some negative. But positive thinking culture demands you dismiss or reframe the negative evidence. Don't focus on that. That's negative thinking. You're manifesting bad outcomes by considering them. So you stop examining negative evidence. And when you stop examining negative evidence, you stop thinking critically. Think about how self-help culture teaches this explicitly. They tell you that acknowledging potential problems makes them more likely. That considering downsides attracts negative outcomes. That pessimism is self-fulfilling, while optimism creates reality. These claims are presented as cosmic truth, but they function as instructions to stop analyzing situations accurately. Look at how this destroys decision-making. Good decisions require weighing evidence, including negative evidence. What could go wrong? Isn't pessimism. It's necessary risk assessment. But positive thinking culture labels risk assessment as negative thinking. So people make decisions while systematically ignoring relevant negative information. Then they're shocked when obvious risks materialize. The philosophical insight is that accurate thinking requires examining reality as it is, not filtering it through mandatory optimism. When you can only consider evidence that supports positive conclusions, you're not thinking, You're rationalizing predetermined conclusions. And rationalization masquerading as thinking makes you extraordinarily vulnerable to manipulation. When you see this pattern clearly, you understand why positive thinking culture produces so many poor decisions. Not because pessimism would be better, but because mandatory optimism prevents the accurate analysis that produces good decisions. You can't make good choices when you're prohibited from examining half the relevant information. I want you to drop this affirmation in the comments. I see the patterns. 3. Good vibes only. Isolates you from necessary feedback. Here's an observation that explains a lot of dysfunction. When you enforce good vibes only, you systematically exclude people who would give you accurate negative feedback. And excluding accurate negative feedback leaves you operating on incomplete, distorted information that makes failure inevitable. Watch who gets excluded from good vibes only spaces. Not people who are actually harmful. They're often charming and positive. The excluded people are those who point out problems, offer critical feedback, or refuse to validate delusions. These are often the people offering the most valuable information. But good vibes only culture labels them toxic and excludes them, leaving you surrounded by yes people who reinforce comfortable illusions. Think about how this plays out in personal development. You share a business idea. People who care about you point out potential problems. But good vibes only mindset interprets this as negativity to be avoided. So you surround yourself with people who uncritically support whatever you do. Then you're shocked when obvious problems destroy your project. The people who could have warned you were excluded for being negative. Look at how social media amplifies this. Algorithms reward positive content and suppress negative content. So your feed becomes a curated stream of wins, successes, and good vibes, while struggles, failures, and problems are algorithmically hidden. This creates a distorted view of reality where problems don't exist because they're not visible. And operating on this distorted view makes you unprepared for actual reality. The philosophical insight is that negative feedback, while uncomfortable, is often more valuable than positive feedback. Positive feedback feels good, but rarely teaches you anything. Negative feedback feels bad, but shows you exactly where you're vulnerable. Good vibes only culture systematically excludes the information most necessary for growth and protection. When you understand this, you can see why people who enforce good vibes only often fail repeatedly. They've created information bubbles that filter out the feedback they most need to hear. They're operating blind while feeling supported, and blindness with encouragement is more dangerous than clear sight without it. I want you to drop this affirmation in the comments. I see beneath the surface. 4. Toxic positivity requires denying legitimate problems. Pay attention to how mandatory optimism forces you to deny real problems, not solve them, deny them. Because acknowledging problems conflicts with required positivity, problems must be reframed as opportunities, blessings in disguise, or manifestations of negative thinking. This systematic denial ensures problems never get addressed because they're not allowed to exist. Watch the linguistic gymnastics required. You're not struggling financially. You're learning abundance mindset. You're not in a dysfunctional relationship. You're growing through challenges. You're not being exploited at work. You're gaining valuable experience. Every genuine problem gets reframed into something positive, which makes actually solving the problem impossible because you can't solve what you won't acknowledge exists. Think about how this plays out in therapy and self-help. Instead of, "You're in a situation that's genuinely harmful and you should leave," you get "Focus on gratitude for what you have and change your perspective." This keeps people in harmful situations longer, because leaving would require acknowledging the situation is bad, which conflicts with mandatory positivity. Look at how organizations use this. Instead of addressing low pay, excessive workload, or toxic management, they offer wellness programs and mindfulness training. The message is clear. The problem isn't the conditions. It's your attitude about the conditions. Change your thinking, not your circumstances. This benefits the organization by ensuring circumstances never improve, while employees blame themselves for feeling bad about objectively bad situations. The philosophical insight is that you can't solve problems you're not allowed to acknowledge exist. Toxic positivity doesn't make problems disappear. It makes you unable to identify and address them. And unaddressed problems compound until they become crises that can't be denied, at which point it's often too late to solve them effectively. When you see this pattern clearly, you understand why people trapped in toxic positivity often hit catastrophic failures. They denied problems until denial was no longer possible, and by then, early intervention opportunities have passed. Mandatory optimism doesn't prevent negative outcomes. It delays recognition until outcomes can't be avoided. I want you to drop this affirmation in the comments. I see what's actually there. 5. Enforced positivity makes you vulnerable to manipulation. Here's the ruthless observation. When you're required to interpret everything positively, you become extraordinarily easy to manipulate. Because manipulators know you'll reframe their exploitation as opportunity, their deception as misunderstanding, their harm as learning experience. Your mandatory positive framing does their work for them. Watch how con artists use this. They target people deep in positive thinking culture because these people will rationalize away red flags. I shouldn't judge. I need to trust the universe. Negative thoughts attract negative outcomes. These beliefs make it impossible to recognize danger until it's too late. The same instincts that should trigger "this person is lying to me" get reframed as "I'm being negative." Think about how abusive relationships exploit this. Abusers select partners who enforce positivity on themselves. These partners will reframe abuse as rough patches, explain away warning signs, and blame themselves for feeling bad rather than recognize they're being harmed. The mandatory positive framing ensures they stay longer, tolerate more, and protect their abuser even from their own accurate threat assessment. Look at how this operates in financial scams. Victims are often deep in manifestation culture, where negative thinking supposedly prevents success. So when they have doubts about an investment, they suppress those doubts as blocking abundance. The very instincts that would protect them, skepticism, risk assessment, critical thinking, are labeled as the problem. Scammers know this and actively recruit from positive thinking communities. The philosophical insight is that accurate threat assessment requires acknowledging when something is threatening. But positive thinking culture frames all threat assessment as negative thinking to be avoided. This creates systematic vulnerability to anyone who understands you'll interpret exploitation positively rather than accurately. When you understand this pattern, you can see why so many positive thinking advocates end up repeatedly victimized. Not because they're stupid, but because they've disabled their threat detection systems in service of mandatory optimism. They're walking through the world blind to danger, interpreting that blindness as spiritual growth. I want you to drop this affirmation in the comments. I choose awareness over virtue. 6. Positive mindset often masks avoidance and inaction. Pay attention to this pattern. Forced optimism often functions as sophisticated procrastination. It will work out, becomes an excuse for not addressing problems that won't work out without intervention. Trust the universe becomes justification for passivity when action is required. Positive thinking becomes a way to avoid uncomfortable but necessary work. Watch how this operates in personal development spaces. Someone has a genuine problem that requires difficult action. Career change, ending a relationship, confronting someone, setting boundaries. Instead of taking that action, they're told to raise their vibration, manifest better outcomes, focus on gratitude. These feel like progress because they're activity, but they're activity that avoids the actual difficult work that would solve the problem. Think about how this plays out with manifestation. Instead of building skills, making connections, or taking risks required for actual opportunity, people visualize, affirm, and align their energy. When opportunities don't materialize, they're told they weren't positive enough, had blocking beliefs, or manifested incorrectly. This keeps them trapped in passive inner work that avoids the active external work that produces results. Look at how organizations exploit this. Instead of making structural changes to address systemic problems, they offer resilience training, mindfulness programs, and positive psychology workshops. These frame problems as individual mindset issues rather than organizational failures. Employees work on their positivity, while organizational dysfunction remains unaddressed. The philosophical insight is that optimism is often a more socially acceptable form of avoidance. Actually solving problems requires acknowledging they exist, analyzing them accurately, and taking difficult action. Positive thinking allows you to skip all that uncomfortable work while feeling like you're doing something productive. But feel-good avoidance doesn't solve actual problems. When you see this clearly, you understand why positive thinking culture often produces spectacular inaction. People spend years working on their mindset, while their actual circumstances don't improve. Because mindset work is a substitute for the difficult external work that creates change. Optimism becomes an opiate that prevents action. I want you to drop this affirmation in the comments. I see the machinery beneath the performance. 7. Realism gets relabeled as negativity to suppress truth. Here's an observation about how mandatory optimism polices itself. Accurate observation of problems gets relabeled as negativity, pessimism, or toxic thinking. This linguistic maneuver makes truth-telling taboo while protecting comfortable illusions. Anyone who sees clearly and speaks honestly gets excluded as a negative influence. Watch how this framing works. You observe that something isn't working. This is neutral observation of fact. But positive thinking culture interprets factual observation as negative thinking. Why are you being so negative? Not because you're wrong, because you're acknowledging something uncomfortable. The problem isn't the reality. The problem is you refusing to pretend the reality is different. Think about how this plays out in declining organizations. Early warnings about problems come from people who see clearly. But those warnings get dismissed as negativity. The people who raise them get marginalized as not culture fit or low energy. Meanwhile, people who maintain optimistic denial get elevated as cultural leaders. So problems compound until denial is no longer sustainable, at which point it's often too late to fix them. Look at how this functions in relationships. One partner accurately identifies dysfunction. The other labels this as negativity and demands positivity instead. The first partner is now in a bind, maintain accuracy and be labelled problematic, or adopt false optimism and enable continued dysfunction. Either way, the problem remains unaddressed because addressing it requires calling it what it is. The philosophical insight is that labelling realism as negativity is a mechanism for maintaining comfortable illusions. It's not that positive thinkers can't see problems, they can. But their system requires them to label accurate perception of problems as the problem, which ensures problems never get addressed directly. Truth-telling becomes deviance to be punished. When you understand this dynamic, you can see why so many systems that enforce positivity eventually catastrophically fail. They've created cultures where truth cannot be spoken without social punishment. So truth stays hidden until reality forces recognition, by which point adaptation is often impossible. Mandatory optimism doesn't prevent failure. It ensures you don't see it coming. I want you to drop this affirmation in the comments. I see clearly. 8. Clear observation beats wishful thinking. Every time, here's the final observation. Systems and people who see reality clearly consistently outperform those who force optimistic interpretations. Not because pessimism is better, but because accurate assessment enables effective response, while distorted assessment produces responses mismatched to actual conditions. Watch this pattern across contexts. Businesses that accurately assess market conditions adapt and survive. Businesses that maintain optimistic denial fail when reality doesn't match their assumptions. Individuals who accurately assess their situation make better decisions than individuals who force positive interpretations of negative circumstances. Clear sight wins. Comfortable illusion loses. Think about how this played out historically. Leaders who saw threats clearly prepared for them and survived. Leaders who maintained optimistic denial that threats would resolve without action perished. Every major historical failure involves some version of they didn't want to believe it could happen, so they convinced themselves it wouldn't. Mandatory optimism preceding catastrophe is a pattern repeated endlessly. Look at the difference between useful optimism and toxic positivity. Useful optimism says, this situation is difficult, but I believe I can handle it if I work intelligently. It acknowledges difficulty while maintaining agency. Toxic positivity says, this situation isn't actually difficult. I just need to think more positively. It denies difficulty, which prevents intelligent response. The philosophical insight is that reality doesn't care about your mindset. Positive thinking doesn't change external circumstances. It changes your internal interpretation of them. When interpretation becomes unmoored from reality, you're operating on fantasy. And fantasy-based decision-making produces predictably poor outcomes regardless of how positive the fantasy feels. Machiavelli understood this. He advocated seeing things as they are, including ugly things, because accurate sight enables effective action. Comfortable delusions enable only deluded action. The prince who saw threats clearly could prepare defenses. The prince who forced optimism about threats was destroyed by them. Clear sight wasn't pessimism. It was survival. When you integrate this understanding, you can distinguish between useful optimism about your capacity to respond and toxic positivity that denies problems exist. The first enables effective action. The second ensures ineffective response to problems you're pretending aren't there. I want you to drop this affirmation in the comments. I choose clarity over comfort. The value of uncomfortable clear sight. So here's what these 8 principles reveal. Mandatory optimism and forced positive thinking aren't tools for your benefit. They're mechanisms that keep you blind to reality and vulnerable to exploitation. They suppress critical thinking. They exclude necessary feedback. They require denying legitimate problems. They make you easy to manipulate. They enable avoidance. They police accurate observation. They produce worse outcomes than clear sight. This isn't advocating pessimism. Pessimism is as distorted as forced optimism. It systematically interprets everything negatively, regardless of reality. Clear observation requires seeing things as they are, positive and negative, without filtering through mandatory emotional framing. The philosophical insight is that reality doesn't require your approval or positive interpretation. It simply is. Your job isn't to think positively about it. Your job is to see it clearly so you can respond effectively. Positive thinking that denies reality helps no one. Clear observation that accepts uncomfortable truth enables intelligent action. Machiavelli would remind you that survival requires seeing threats clearly, not maintaining comfortable optimism about their absence. That effectiveness requires accurate assessment, not positive reframing of negative circumstances. That clear sight, even of uncomfortable realities, is more valuable than comforting delusions that leave you unprepared. If this video revealed patterns you sensed but couldn't articulate, hit that like button. Share it with someone trapped in toxic positivity culture. And subscribe, because we're going to keep exploring the gap between feel-good illusions and clear observation. Now, I want you to drop this final affirmation in the comments. I am powerful and kind. See clearly. Think accurately. Observe without distortion. Now go replace forced optimism with clear sight that actually serves you.